23. Uçan Süpürge Uluslararası Kadın Filmleri Festivali'nden herkese merhabalar. Bugün aramızda Vicenza Sirifis ve Bahar Topçu var. Kendilerini ekofeminizm konusunda dinleyeceğiz. Bahar bir bale öğretmeni ve iklim aktivisti. Yeşil Gazete'de yazıyor ve ekoloji kısmının editörü. Master'ını Bilgi Üniversitesi'nde iklim aktivizmi üzerine yapıyor. Kendisini bir yeşil ve feminist olarak tanımlıyor. Vicenza ise ekofeminizm aktivisti ve İrlanda'da bir ekofeminist kolektifin parçası. Fossil Free NI aktivist grubunun da bir parçası. Ekstraktivizm ve kadın meselesinde doktorasını yapıyor. Şimdi İngilizceye geçiyoruz ancak bundan sonraki kısmı çevrilecek. So I want to introduce our friends again. Hello from 23rd Flying Broom International Women's Film Festival. Vicenza Sirifis is an Irish ecofeminist and part of an ecofeminist collective in Ireland. She's also the coordinator of the Fossil Free NI activist group, and she's doing her PhD on women and extractivism in Ireland. Bahar Topçu is a ballet instructor and climate activist. She writes at Yeşil Gazete, a Turkey-based paper about ecology, and is the editor of activism section of the paper. She does her master's at Bilgi University in Turkey about the performances of climate activism in Turkey. She describes herself as a green and a feminist. Now, I yield the floor to Bahar and Vicenza.
Thank you, Dicle. So, hello, Vicenza, again.
Hello.
So you're saying that women are always in the front lines of environmental struggles, and I think we can say the same for Turkey as well, not surprisingly. And ecofeminism is getting more and more important place in current feminist discussions in academic works or its activism practices as well. So please, can you tell us how did you choose to describe yourself as ecofeminist first? How did you become related to its theory, its everyday life practices, and its activism as well?
I guess I always identified as an environmentalist and also a feminist, but it kind of took me until I started my undergraduate degree to read about ecofeminism and connect these two theories together. And I remember reading the paragraph about ecofeminism and kind of like light bulb going off in my mind. And yeah, it really helped me to see how different oppressions and struggles are interconnected and are like weaved together. And I guess like at the heart, I understand ecofeminism as being about like locating the root causes of a lot of crises, sexism, climate change, racism, in sort of oppressive systems, so capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. So I guess like it's not really new to feminism, but what ecofeminism does is brings in non-human nature as an oppressed category as well. And that's what I really love about it. And I guess sort of in my activism, I'm really influenced by this whole worldview and way of looking at the world, and looking at things from a very like systemic point of view. Yeah, so I've been lucky to do research on ecofeminism academically, but also be involved in the Dublin Ecofeminist Collective that was mentioned earlier. That's a really great community where there's lots of like marches and workshops and events organised. And also other feminist organisations in Ireland I'm involved in, like the Galway Feminist Collective, which isn't explicitly ecofeminist, but they really understand the kind of connection between environmental justice and gender justice as well. Yeah, so those are kind of the activist movements that I've been involved in that really take this kind of structural look at things. And that's kind of, a really nice thing about ecofeminism is, it is an academic thing, but it's very much about collective movements and challenging the oppressive kind of structures that have got us into this mess. And I get a lot of sort of connection and feelings of solidarity from being in these groups, which is really great.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about ecofeminist activism more specifically. I'm really wondering about, I want to talk about ecofeminist approach to our relation with nature, actually, and some critics to ecofeminism. To some critics to it, some of them says that it's so essentialist because naming the planet as Mother Earth or assigning a nature to the productivity of the nature is a little essentialist. And at the same time, do you think that it's a little opted out from some power struggles in politics? Let's put it more simply, that what did you feel about the results of the referendum in 2018 about the 8th Amendment of Irish Constitution? What did you feel about that? Because abortion was not abortion legalized after the referendum in Ireland. And how did ecofeminists get in part of this abortion rights movement? And what do you think about that? And also, I would like to add this later in our talk. Do you think that ecofeminist approach and its answers are most dominantly have answers on rural life rather than urban city life? What to think about all those?
Sure. Where to start? Oh my goodness.
I lost some time, but we will talk about it.
Sure. I guess starting with the essentialist point, which I think is a really important thing to talk about when we're talking about ecofeminism, and I'm really glad you brought that up, actually. So I think a lot of ecofeminism has been heavily critiqued as being essentialist, and I think that is actually a very accurate thing to critique it as. But I guess, like feminism, there's lots of different strands of ecofeminism, and sort of it can be separated into two sort of broad branches. So you have cultural ecofeminism and then more material ecofeminism. And the cultural strand is very essentialist, and I don't really follow that strand so much. It's sort of it was mainly developed by white middle-class women in America in the 80s and 90s, and they kind of drew on this special cosmological spiritual link between women and nature, and they talk a lot about sort of Mother Earth and goddess worship. And I guess politically that's quite problematic, because it's, appropriating from Indigenous cultures a lot of the time, but without engaging with Indigenous struggles. And then as well, it's implying that women are all like one category, with no difference between it, and it totally hides any other type of gender identity as well. It's very kind of to be a woman, you have to be this way. But I guess the branch that I'm more identified with is the material ecofeminism, and it sort of says that nature and woman are socially constructed categories. So that the root of the connection between woman and nature is actually in the capitalist patriarchal mode of production, and the way that these systems push the worst impacts of environmental degradation or climate change onto women. And the relationships that they have with the environment are connected to how gender roles are socialized in society, and this sort of gender division of labor, where women are doing most of the care work and reproductive work, and so they kind of have a closer material link to the environment. So yeah, that's kind of how I see the whole essentialist debate. And I think it's important not to disregard like the whole movement just because some of it is essentialist, because I think it can give a lot of really good insights, especially around intersectionality, because it was one of the first sort of movements to talk about that after it was developed by Black feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw. Yeah, like ecofeminism was one of the early movements that was talking about how race and class and ethnicity and sexuality and gender and the environment are all connected and intersect with each other. Yeah, and then about the 8th Amendment.
I'm so curious about process.
No, I'm really happy to talk about it actually, because it was such a huge moment for Ireland, and it was like really just a testament to like grassroots activism working, and like all of the work that gone in over 30 years of feminist organising in Ireland. And I had the privilege to be part of pro-choice groups in Ireland leading up to the referendum with Galway Pro-Choice. And that was, it was just an amazing thing to be part of. And then I was actually living abroad for the year of the referendum, but was able to still to do solidarity actions away. And it was cool to see a lot of Irish people live abroad, and they were doing lots of solidarity actions all over the world. But yeah, from like an ecofeminist point of view, and the referendum, so many different types of feminist groups were organizing on this issue. It was really like the main issue for a long time leading up to the referendum. But we see the ecofeminist community in Dublin, they were super active in campaigning for repeal. So they were like canvassing, going door to door, holding fundraisers, going to marches, talking to politicians. And the same can be said with the Galway Feminist Collective, Galway Pro-Choice, lots of different groups across the island. And I guess from an ecofeminist point of view, like the groups I was involved in really understood reproductive justice as connected to environmental justice, because they took this kind of systematic approach. So how they sort of understood that, or how I understand that, is that systems of oppression like colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism, they're dependent on creating like the self and the other. And the self has all of the agency and control, and then the other is something that can be seen as just a resource to be controlled and exploited and dominated. And the system does that to nature, it does it to women, it does it to Indigenous communities, anyone that it sees as just an object. And in this case, I feel like women's bodies were very much seen as a resource that needed to be disciplined and controlled to produce labor for the system to continue, the power for capitalism to continue. And it's like a totally dehumanizing worldview, and it can be connected to the way the system treats nature as a free resource to be extracted from as much as possible. And as well, you know, like reproductive justice, I see it as much more than just like the physical act of giving birth. Sort of reproductive activities are life-sustaining practices. And so, you know, real reproductive justice includes like the right to housing, a clean environment, economic and social well-being as well. So it's all really like interconnected as well. Yeah, if that makes sense.
So much. It's really nice to hear all those opinions in the ecofeminist view as well. And what you said about the woman's body, and one that she was saying came to my mind, and she says that patriarchy and modern medicine are talking really collectively to degrade one's body, and it's all totally come together with your words actually for me. And we are experiencing the same thing in the climate justice movements, and young people, women are on the front lines of the climate justice women as well, and they are making this activism. So actually, and some patriarchal, I don't know why, but actually I know why, but I want to hear it from you at the same time. What do you think about that? You know, some white and rich men hate young people, young women who are fighting for climate justice, actually. And it's meaningless in a way, but it's just because of their hatred, their misogyny, and they also became the strong deniers of climate change as well. And this patriarchal approach and misogyny are working together. So, you know, collectively, what they think about this and what they think about climate movement and feminist movement solidarity at the same time, because we are answering all those critics and hatred together in a kind of you know, a collaborative way. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're so right that it is young people and women on the front line of the fight against climate change. And I was really lucky to do an internship with WeCan, which is the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. And they're really about documenting and highlighting the work that women do on the front lines of the fight against climate change around the world. And yeah, I guess from my point of view, I think just to talk about why so many women are involved in this fight and young people on the fight on the front lines, I sort of see it not because there's some like essentialist link that women are more caring about the environment. I think it's because the system doesn't work for these groups of people. They're already exploited and facing the worst impacts of the neoliberal system. So in many ways, I think it's easier to see the oppression of nature then when you're facing so many oppressions in your own life. But I guess it varies as well across context. And I think it's important to see how sort of gender intersects with like age and class and ethnicity and sexuality as well to influence all these things. But yeah, I think as well, you know, this misogyny that women are facing, and just as well to like point out that, you know, Indigenous women and women of colour in the global south are facing like this triple threat of like colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and there's so much gender specific threats to earth defenders around sexual violence, death threats, and even like the slower type of violence through like eroding their like livelihoods and their water systems or the land that they might rely on to like live. And yeah, so I really think that the whole system that produces climate change is based in patriarchy, and that's connected to, you know, capitalism and colonialism. But we're seeing sort of like the patriarchal side of the system reacting to these activists who are really transgressing what is acceptable gender roles in this patriarchal worldview. Sort of they're stepping up and sort of speaking out, and maybe publicly facing roles, and that's just so unacceptable, I guess, to the system, because it's challenging, like you say, so many different parts of the system. Yeah, and then as well, like whenever we think about feminist solidarity and feminist sort of insights to the climate movement, I think this is really amazing what feminism can bring to the climate movement, you know, connecting struggles. And I think it really brings the whole idea that, you know, this isn't about fixing an environment that exists out there separate from society. We're talking about social justice as well. And yeah, I think this is what really like feminist approaches bring. And I think it's so important as well because we see as well, like most of the grassroots organizing is done by women around the world, especially women of color and Indigenous women. But then as you move up into, you know, more mainstream NGOs or the policymakers and institutional roles, you see a majority of white Western men. So it's really important to have a feminist lens pointing this out all the time as well. And yeah, I guess some of the things that I love about feminist approaches to the climate movement have been the way it points out sort of the systemic roots of the crisis. So pointing out that, you know, these neoliberal approaches based on individual lifestyle change aren't enough. It's like the system that needs to be changed. So for example, like if you're talking about changing household consumption practices, but without challenging the gender division of labor in households, you know, you're just gonna replicate the system that we already have and keep it going. And, you know, saying that these technological fixes or solutions that are inside the market, they just leave these unequal power relations in place. So they're not really addressing the root of the crisis. It allows kind of domination and exploitation to continue. And you even see that like with my work around the mining industry, where they're trying to greenwash the mining industry to say, you know, that we are the savior in the situation, we can produce these minerals for renewable energy and technologies. And of course, renewables are super important, but if we allow like one big set of corporations to step in the place of the fossil fuel industry, we're not, you know, challenging this need for constant growth, all of the injustices, the human rights abuses, the environmental destruction that these companies cause. And so feminists, I think, have been amazing at pointing for different solutions that prioritize, yeah, like challenging sexism, challenging racism, and yeah, looking at different, more sort of deep analysis of the crisis.
Yes, exactly. Maybe a small addition to your words, I would like to do that. Most of researchers are saying that women are at the first line who are affected from climate change impacts. And even though they are in the global south or global north, it's not changing. Women in every level, women are affected from the climate change impacts. And on the contrary, when we look at the reasons of climate change, as you said, that the system and the decision makers and are not equally, equal. There is not equal gender equal between women and men. Mostly in the patriarchal fossil fuel approach that we are facing with when it comes to reasons of climate change. So to put it as a reality, I think shows a lot about the importance of feminist approach to the crisis as well. Is what you're saying were so important. I think so.
Yeah, you're so right. And we have a great podcast by two Irish ecofeminists called Mothers of Invention, and their tagline is climate change is a man-made solution with a man-made problem with a feminist solution. And I think that really sums it up.
Yeah, it sums it up. But we need more feminists in the field.
Absolutely.
From man and woman as well.
Exactly, yeah, from all genders, absolutely.
Yes. And one last question that I have about this current pandemic crisis. Since this pandemic, COVID-19 spread and several different prosecutions have been taken by governments, what has changed in your life and hasn't changed as well? Do you still have chance to be active on those communities and activist groups? Can you tell us about how you are getting related to each other in this, online world?
Yeah, sure. I've actually been really pleasantly surprised at the connection you can still have using these online platforms. And it's been great. I've been able to continue having like online meetings and facilitate some workshops as well online. I actually co-facilitated one yesterday, which was really nice. I'm involved in this network as well called Active Hope, which is kind of looking at our inner response to the crisis that we see in the world, and so it's really relevant for the times we're in. So we've been doing lots of workshops to support activists at this time online, which has been really nice. And yeah, I think as well, what's been really inspiring to see is the ecofeminist community in Dublin have been really active in joining and starting up mutual aid projects in their communities. So, you know, and I think that's really what ecofeminism is about, you know, shift from this individualistic competition society towards one based on sort of empathy and solidarity. So that's really, really great to see that kind of shift happening. And I guess that's why building communities or like through activism is so important, because in times like these, you know, they really come to support you, which is great. And as well, I can maybe do a bit of a plug. So on the 20th of May, the Galway Feminist Collective, together with Friends of the Earth Ireland, we're hosting a webinar on colonialism, patriarchy, and climate change. So if anyone would like to log into that, it would be great to have you there. So yeah, we're using this kind of opportunity to invite Indigenous speakers or women from the Global South that we wouldn't normally have at our meetings, but we can do that with the internet. So it's really great chance to platform some voices that we wouldn't normally get to hear from if we had like an in-person event.
Yes, I would like to thank you for the information. Wow, what a collaboration, Vincenza.
A lot going on.
Yeah. Wow, it was so exciting to hear some, you know, ecofeminist effort from you. It was great. Thank you.
No, thank you.
So, okay.
Anything else you would like to share, Bahar or Vincenza?
Yeah, I would like to see you more, girls.
Okay, so then I'll get to wrap up. We thank Bahar and Vincenza for their marvelous contribution. I hope, and I'm sure actually, that it will be as thought-provoking as it will be to our audience, as it was to me. So that was an honor. Thank you so much. Evet arkadaşlar, Vincenza ve Bahar'ı dinledik ekofeminizm konusunda. Eminim bu benim için olduğu kadar sizler için de öğretici bir röportaj olmuştur. Bizimle beraber oldukları için tekrar çok teşekkür ediyoruz.